People, welcome back to Fistful of Cards. I'm your best friend, Patrick Farron. Today, we will be talking about another Doomtown deck tech. Today is Scoot and Boot out of Beyond the Veil. Let me scroll up. Now, before we get into all this, we're going to talk about who is this for and what is our goal. If you're the kind of player who likes to play control decks, and you're the kind of player who likes to create a huge plan that comes together in order to create a victory, or if you're the kind of player who likes to really take advantage of what people call the chess aspect of Doomtown Reloaded, then this one's for you, because our goal is to create a board state with as many control pieces as possible in order for us to make it so that our opponent cannot stop us once we put them in check by denying them their movement and denying them their influence capabilities. So let's get into it. First and foremost, we always talk about our structure. As you can see, our structure is terrible. Although technically a lot of people say you should have 40 on value cards for any deck. You should have a shootout concept that is 40 cards. We almost make that. Technically we have 38. However, I would recommend that you never actually get into a fight because this isn't that kind of deck. And in addition, you can see that we are running 57 cards. I would recommend that you cheat as much as possible when you play this game, just to give yourself any kind of advantage. Now, obviously, I'm joking. We're going to talk about a couple of different options that you have in the deck. The first and foremost, it's a little bit difficult to talk about a control list in any game. Or, because a lot of you're going to be saying, like, well, if they do this, then do that. Also, there's construction going on in the background. Again, I apologize. I wish I could just stop it, but I'm going to try and edit it out. I apologize if it gets on your guys' nerves. It's the best that I can do. So, we're running Beyond the Veil. We have 19 wealth and 3 production. Our passive ability is while your dudes are at a deed with a totem, they have +1 influence. Our noon boot ability is boot a totem you control to move one of your dudes to its location, parentheses, from anywhere, which is important. And the passive ability is actually something we're going to be taking a good amount of value out of, and the movement, of course, is always good. So, what are we doing in this list? So like I said, this is a control list. So we're going to be talking about a lot of different elements and a lot of cheeky plays that you can make. So what makes control lists different in Doomtown than in other card games? Well, in other card games like Magic the Gathering or Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Pokemon, things like that, control lists tend to do things where they just sort of deny your opponents by removing threats either before they come into play, like a counter spell sort of aspect, or they remove them once they've hit the play table, like something that just removes things entirely. And Doomtown is not a game that has a whole lot of either of those elements. There's not a whole lot of counter spell play. There's also not a whole lot of straight noon removal. There's not a card, for example, that's like noon ace a dude that's in play, obviously, because that would be insane. However, what we can do is we can focus a lot on out-moving our opponent and booting them so they can't move, hence the name Scoot and Boot. Now, this is a very old archetype that's existed since Classic, and in Doomtown Reloaded, it's kind of slowly come into play, and even now it's a little bit janky, but everybody really responded well to our coverage list, which is a little bit janky. So I figured, what the hell, more jank. So, what do we do in this list? So first and foremost, we do have 12 deeds. We're running a lot of 2/1/1s as per usual. We're going to be focusing on getting these deeds into play to generate our win condition. Now, much like dudes and deeds or things like that, at the end of the day, we're going to be surviving, and that's what a lot of this list does. But how do we put ourselves into a winning position? Well, unlike dudes and deeds, which is sort of a one-trick kind of deck. It's a very one-note deck. It just pushes and pushes and pushes and pushes as hard as and as fast as possible. This deck has a little bit more nuance. It has a little bit more spices in the soup. So we're trading some of that speed. We're trading some of that consistency for more powerful effects. And we're going to go through some of our options. Now, I want to cover hearts and starting posse first, which is unusual. So, our hearts, we've got two different totems. We've got Red Horse's Tail and Spirit Trail. We also have Many Speak as One and Ghostly Communion. So right off the bat, you can tell that we have a couple of things. One, we have two cards that give us movement capability. Spirit Trail and Ghostly Communion, both our movement. So we get free movement. We also get free movement from our home. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. In addition, we also have Red Horse's Tail, which we're going to primarily be using the noon ability of, which is boot a dude at, with the value of X at the location of the totem. Normally a decent card, but is primarily used for its shootout ability, which is like a built-in pistol whip. A lot of people ran this kind of thing in Fortress decks, for example. But we're going to be coming back to this card in a second because it actually is one of our optional cards. The rest of these cards are pretty mandatory, I would say. However, this one is an optional card that plays around with some of the stuff that our deck can do. The other card that we have is Many Speak as One. Now, Many Speak as One is a very interesting and unique card. What it does is it basically puts an Ancestor Spirit token into play at the location that the card is used. Because I don't have it in front of me, I'm just going to tell you what the Ancestor Spirit does. It's a 0 stud with 1 influence. Its ability is if it ever is moved, it dies, or it's removed from play, essentially. So we can't move it, and we can't really fight. So what are we going to be doing with this? What we're going to be doing is we're going to be using it to sit on our opponent's deeds. So some of our early heart combos that we can look at is we can do things like we can Spirit Trail one of our dudes to an opponent's deed. We can Many Speak as One to put a token onto that deed and gain control of it. And then when threatened, our shaman can just go home, either with Beyond the Veil or Ghostly Communion. And that's a very simplistic concept, is that I have left a token to fight over your deed. I don't care if that token dies. If you need to call that token out and we need to fight, and I'll just fight you with the top 5 cards of my deck, and maybe I'll get lucky. But more often what you're doing is you're wasting your opponent's time, because it's very difficult to compete with a high movement capability deck if you don't have a lot of movement. And most decks don't have a lot of movement. Specifically, they don't have a lot of noon movement. Even decks that have more movement, like a horse deck, a lot of that is tied to shootouts. It's getting into shootouts and moving into shootouts. It's not just moving dudes as a noon action. And so having more noon movement than your opponent allows you to do what's called chessing your opponent. You'll see that term used a lot on the forums and on the Facebook group is, oh, I just chessed my opponent. And chessing is a slang term, basically means that you, instead of outgunning your opponent in a shootout, you basically used movement and outmaneuvered them in order to win the game. And that's basically what this deck is going to do. So moving over into the clubs for a second, because they have synergies with everything else on the deck, we're going to be talking about these club options. Now we have Foreboding Glance. All of these are pretty underrepresented cards. Foreboding Glance is a funky card. It has a crap ton of text. We only really care about a couple of lines of text out of this. The first one is choose your dude and opposing dude in the same location. So we can only use this if we have our dude and an opposing dude in the same place. The other part of this line that matters is if your dude has more influence, boot the opposing dude. So immediately we can see synergies that we have. So most basic thing we can do with this card is if our opponent moves into a location that we're at and we have more influence than them, we can boot them. Easy, right? So they can't call us out if they're booted. Easy, easy, easy. However, there's a couple of things that combo with this. One, our passive. If we have dudes at a deed with a totem, they get +1 influence. So all of a sudden, our dudes that are at the location of our Spirit Trails and Red Horse's Tails are capable of having more influence. You know, if our 1 influence dude becomes a 2 influence dudes, most dudes, especially in starting posses, don't have 2 influence, which means that we can boot dudes that are coming to call us out. In addition to that, we can also do some cheeky stuff with that. Things like Many Speak as One, which summons our 1 influence ancestor token. Now we can combine that with Foreboding Glance to do things like, okay, I've Spirit Trailed over to your deed. I've dropped another Spirit Trail, right? So I've got my 2 Spirit Trails. I use my mini as 1 to summon an ancestor token. The ancestor token now has 2 influence because it's a dude at a location with a totem, and now any dude with 2 or less influence, I can foreboding glance, so I can deny you the ability to fight me, and you have to spend more of your resources in order to call out my token, and my token is fodder. It doesn't matter. And so you can see all of these tie to this concept of wasting your opponent's time and actions in order to win the game. So moving through this list some more, we have this is a holdup. This is a holdup takes advantage of our opponent's economy. Now remember, when I talked in the Dudes and Deeds video, at the end we talked a little bit about overarching Doomtown philosophy. And we talked a little bit about this concept of if I need to build a deck, I need to create, how do I generate these 3 things? But in addition, how do I deny these 3 things? So how do I deny my opponent's economy? How do I deny their influence? How do I deny their control points? This is a holdup denies money. It specifically steals money from your opponent. Now, normally this is an extremely high risk card, because booting your dude at your opponent's deed is very risky, even if you were in an actual shootout list, which we're not. However, we have tokens, and tokens don't matter. So we can just boot our token to rob our opponent of their money, denying them future financial gain, which then allows us to blockade them, in a sense, in order to make it so that we deny them earlier and we can win the game faster. If our opponent can't play cards, it is very likely that we are able to counter them. Easy, easy, easy. Rumors, we've talked about in other lists. Rumors gives dudes -1 influence if they're not at home. When combined in conjunction with our booting cards, we can boot our opponent's dudes at locations that are not at home, and we can give them -1 influence, and unlike in other decks, that -1 influence cannot be regained because they can't move. So again, this card allows us to keep our opponent in check on those big final turns where we're looking to win the game. Under the Weather, bizarre card. No one plays this card, but you could. One of our optional cards. All of these are kind of in the optional card category. Our clubs are optional. Under the Weather is an extremely unique card. It is a global boot that's based on pulls. Now, the big downside of this card is that it itself is a 5, which means that if we pull Under the Weather on a 5, that's not a whole lot of dudes. There's not too many dudes whose grit is 5 or less, because it does pull against grit. However, most of our deck is 10 or higher, and that covers a lot more dudes. Now, keep in mind that this is a noon action. It is a global noon action. It doesn't require you to be at the same location. It doesn't require you to have 2 dudes. It doesn't require you to have more influence. It doesn't require any of that. All it requires is that you point at someone and say, I want them to boot, and then you pull to see if that's true. And even though 5 isn't the highest grit, it still covers quite a few dudes. A lot of low value influence drops that are in most people's starting posses. Things like Jake Smiley, Irving Patterson, Philip Swinford, Cook, things of those natures. Even Valeria is booted by Under the Weather pulling itself because her grit is 5. So that's an interesting option. It's a very underused card, and it doesn't cost us any money. It doesn't cost anything to play. So that's a very interesting card option to look at. So that's a lot of our combo pieces, and as you can see, what we're going to end up doing is we're going to create these crazy complex board states where our opponent's going to be holding our head, much like you might be doing right now, and going, good lord, what is going on? Okay, well, if I move here, then you move here, but oh, I forgot about the Beyond the Veil, but then okay, then you can do here and move there and move there. So it's obviously a more complex deck than some of the other decks we've talked about, and that's just going to be the case. If you're someone who's like, I am just starting out, I can't even remember if I can go home without booting, then this probably isn't the list for you. But keep it in mind, because it's something that's really fun and really unusual about Doomtown, that's pretty unexplored by and large. So let's talk about how some of these pieces kind of work with our starting posse. Now, our starting posse is pretty standard stuff. We've got a bunch of cheap influence dudes. Alexander can obviously combo with Foreboding Glance. He becomes a 3 influence if we get him into the location of a totem. He isn't a shaman, though, so there's a couple of cheeky things that you can do with him, but he's not super flexible. Mazel, old Maz. Maz is a guy, and he can move to the location of a totem, which is actually pretty relevant because it gives us a little bit more movement. However, one that I want to talk about is the difference between this dude and this dude. Inape is an option for our upkeep dude because we're only really going to run one. Inape has 1 influence, but he has 2 influence during high noon, so he's basically a 3 influence dude. His ability to boot is whatever, doesn't really matter, but his ability to have 3 influence is very interesting, because if we're running cards like Foreboding Glance, and if we're just trying to take control of our opponent's deeds and things like that, he can do that, and he's very, very powerful from the get-go. He becomes a 4 influence dude if he's at the location of a totem, so pretty much you're going to Foreboding Glance anyone you want. However, this dude, Kabeda? Question mark? Don't know. Kabeda is an interesting dude for a different reason. Now, Kabeda has a very unique ability. Her ability is that she can use noon abilities on totems in an adjacent location to herself. Basically, what that means is any totem that says something like, I don't know, boot a dude at this location, she can use at her location, provided that the totem is adjacent. Now, that's not so good. I mean, it's pretty useful. It allows, with other totems, you can do crazy crap with that. However, with this totem, what we can do is we can create adjacency with Spirit Trail. Now, what this allows us to do is we can make it so that our red horse's tail at home can be used to boot a dude at our opponent's deed if we haven't played a red horse's tail on their deed to defend it. Because as long as she is at our opponent's deed, and there's 2 Spirit Trails, so let me slow this down a little bit. Spirit Trail makes it so that it's adjacent to all other Spirit Trails, which means that we can do things like we can put one on our home, we can put one at our opponent's location, and we can just move from our home to that location without booting because they're adjacent, right? So that gives us even more movement shenanigans that our opponent may not have access to. The other thing that you can do with this is because they're adjacent, that means that this, at the same location as this, becomes adjacent to all the locations that are attached to it, right? So that makes sense. So Kabeda being able to use totems at her location means that she can use Red Horse's tail at any location that's attached to a Spirit Trail, which means that if you're going to run her in your starting posse, you can do things like boot dudes at your opponent's deeds with totems that are behind you. And that may sound confusing, and if you get really good at this deck, your opponent's definitely going to think so, because your opponent's going to be just constantly having to do math, and that can frustrate anybody into making a lot of mistakes, and this deck can take huge advantage of those mistakes. So if I were going to build this list at this very moment, I would probably take out a couple, it's rough because I like all the cards so much. I would probably take out most of the Under the Weathers, or some of the This Is a Holdup. One of these two, depending on how much my, because this card is only as good as our opponent is running deeds that have more than 1 production. It's not as good if our opponent only has 1 production deeds. So I might take out a lot of This Is a Holdup and just run the rest of this as is. Because we only need to lose, 5 cards in order to get down to the thing. And you also will only be playing one of these or the other, so you just ditch that one. So you're going to be basically getting rid of 1 card at 4, and then... Or you can run some sort of 2-2-2-2-2 combination thing. Anyway, I know this was a lot. I know this one's really confusing and really long. I just wanted to talk to you guys about it So, hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. If you have any questions or comments, we would love to see you in the comments section. And, of course, we will see you next time. Peace.